Hi folks, Adam Andrews here. A little food for thought today for all you parents and teachers who have ever stood up in front of a room of students and tried to execute a literature and composition class. Tell me if this teaching strategy doesn't sound familiar to you. A teacher assigns a work of literature, say The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And then after the students have read it, he takes the opportunity afforded by this book to use a scene in the story or a character in the story to execute a series of lessons on some moral or ethical or philosophical or political issue brought up by the story. Let's say the scene is Hester's refusal to name her lover in the Scarlet Letter. And the idea that he wants to execute the lessons on is the propriety of adultery or individualism or repression in the face of a legalistic society. And in order to have these lessons and have this conversation with his students, he decides to assign a series of exercises on discussion and speaking and writing and thinking about these issues, either adultery or individualism or repression in the face of a legalistic society. And so he assigns a series of exercises that have as their aim two things. Number one, the inculcation of techniques for discussion and speaking and thinking and writing about ideas. And number two, the enforcing of correct opinions, sanctioned opinions about adultery or individualism or repression in the face of a legalistic society. And the students, dutiful students that they are, complete the exercises and acquire the skills intended, which include increased facility with discussion and thinking and speaking and writing about the ideas, adultery, individualism, repression, and also the growth of correct and well-formed opinions about these issues, adultery, individualism, repression. It's a very successful process, and the teacher and the students have had profound conversations about the issues, adultery, individualism, repression, all along the way. And their skill at expressing their opinions on these topics has increased dramatically. And the teacher is gratified at the success of all his efforts. And so he concludes at the end, importantly, that since this entire profound, successful process was occasioned by a work of literature, that literature has been done. That he can actually put paid to the literature line of the curriculum, that this was actually a class in literature and composition. And so he can pat himself on the back, pat his students on the back, and say together that they have done The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, have improved it greatly, and can move on to the next thing on the list. Here's the food for thought part of my little video today. I want to suggest to you that there is a party to the conversation about adultery and individualism and repression in the face of a legalistic society, without whose participation this conversation cannot ever be said to be a literary one, and whose participation has not been included, whose opinion about those issues, adultery, individualism, repression, has not been consulted, who has not been a party to the conversation at all. And that person, of course, is Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter. No one has asked him in the course of this conversation, the point of which was to inculcate in the student techniques of discussion and thinking and speaking and writing about adultery and individualism and repression. No one has asked Nathaniel Hawthorne what his opinions about these subjects are. Worse still, no one has checked to see whether The Scarlet Letter, the book that occasioned these conversations, actually talks about those things at all. The exercises that the teacher has assigned do not help the student or the teacher or anyone else participating in that class determine whether those are the issues that were in Nathaniel Hawthorne's mind when he wrote The Scarlet Letter. And so, while the exercises may be very productive, and undoubtedly they were, given the results, the student's talent and ability to think clearly and speak with eloquence and grace and power and write persuasively and clearly and develop well-formed opinions about adultery and individualism and repression in the face of a repressive, legalistic society. All those things have been developed wonderfully. I'm sure that the techniques and the exercises were effective. None of those things can be properly said to be literary in their aim or execution because of their exclusion of the author and his ideas from the conversation. It's not true, actually, that literature and composition have been addressed in this lesson. Only composition, with an addition of moral philosophy, ethics, political science, and the other issues that are involved in discussing adultery and individualism and repression in the face of a legalistic society. The food for thought issue today is that we might be doing our students a disservice to call it literature and composition, when what we're really aiming for is composition pure and simple, the ability to express one's own opinions. The truth is that a true literary education, especially in the high school years and below, involves more of learning what the opinions of others are. And by others, we mean thinkers and philosophers like Mark Twain and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and their compatriots. About learning what the opinions of the wise are, more than developing our own. It's appropriate, when you think about it, that students be primarily adept at learning and explaining the learned opinions of others before they get too heavily into expressing their own opinions. We find that it is usually more effective to listen before you speak. A lot of people will say literature is important because you need to read before you can write. You need to have things to say before you can learn to say them well. And I would agree with that, but maybe go a step further. Saying that you have to read before you can write is a little bit like saying you have to sit on your hands while someone else is speaking, so that when he's done, you can raise them and give your own opinion about the matter. I think we can always do more listening. We can always learn better how to understand what someone else is saying before we rush in to give our own opinions. Some people often ask me, well, what is writing for then in the literary context? If not an exercise in expressing our own opinions about certain philosophical and moral and ethical topics with grace and eloquence and power. Well, here's another food for thought. The best use of writing in pursuit of literature, especially at the high school level and below, is to explain what the author said and what he meant by it, without any admixture of our own opinions about his topic. Until we can do this effectively, we have no business entering the great conversation with him at all. Listening well, understanding an author on his own terms, is an absolute prerequisite to expressing our own opinions. Food for thought today. I would encourage you to consider literature and composition either as together an exercise in listening, in reading and then explaining the author's point, the author's story, the author's themes, or as two separate subjects, literature for reading and listening, composition for writing and expressing our own opinions. Let's not confuse the two. Let's not confuse literature with rhetoric. Instead, let's consider them both in terms of the unique benefits that they can offer to the student. A little food for thought as you go about your teaching and reading work today. Love to hear what you think about that hopefully controversial opinion. Leave me a comment below or get in touch with us at centerforlit.com. Until we meet again, my friends, happy reading.